Hello and good afternoon. I'm Deirdre Cross, Assistant Director of Public Programs at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Today's program supports the museum's exhibition on the Reconstruction Era entitled Make Good the Promises, Reclaiming Reconstruction and Its Legacies. Today's conversation will underscore the advancements made by African Americans in biomedical and genetic science. During Reconstruction, formerly enslaved people were able to attend independent schools and universities in which they received formal instruction in various fields, including science and medicine. This first cohort of Black doctors and scientists made significant discoveries in the field of medicine and educated future generations of biomedical professionals at historically Black institutions. Unfortunately, many of these pioneers have not been mentioned in history books. This program is the first in a series of collaborations produced with the National Human Genome Research Institute. And so I'd like to introduce Mr. Vince Bonham, Acting Director, as he extends his welcome. And thank you for joining us today.
So thank you, Ms. Cross. Again, good afternoon. Again, my name is Vince Bonham. I'm the Acting Deputy Director at the National Human Genome Research Institute at the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health is made up of 27 institutes and centers that are focused on improving health across our country and globally. The National Human Genome Research Institute is focused on how we use genetic and genomic information to improve individuals' health. On behalf of the National Human Genome Research Institute, I want to express my appreciation to the National Museum of African American History and Culture for their continued partnership with the National Human Genome Research Institute for the past decade. I want to thank especially Leslie Walker and Deirdre Cross for their constant collegiality in working with us. For the past 10 years, NHGRI and the museum have collaborated on a number of symposia on the African diaspora and programs illuminating the life and contributions of Henrietta Lacks and the role of genetics and genomics and biomedical research in the African community and the African American community. The conversations are important both for the perspective of the advancements in genetics and genomics, but also the historical abuses. So this program, the first of four, as Ms. Cross stated, will highlight some of the important issues with regards to African Americans in medicine, biomedical research in genetic and genomic science. We are pleased to work with the museum again. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Leslie Walker, producer here at the museum, and I have the privilege of introducing our esteemed panelists. Our panelists include Dr. Vanessa Northington Gamble, who is a university professor of medical humanities at the George Washington University. Dr. Gamble is an internationally recognized expert on the history of American medicine and racial disparities in healthcare and bioethics. We also have Dr. Wangui Mugwai, who is a professor at Brandeis University. She's a historian of medicine and science. Her research focuses on race and health with an emphasis on the history of childbirth and childhood. We also have Dr. Adam Iggs, who is the postdoctoral research fellow at Johns Hopkins University in the History of Medicine department. His current research project is titled Strange Cures: Black Doctors, Harlem Hospital, and the New Negro in American Medicine from 1919 to 1935. And our conversation will be moderated by Callie Crossley, host and commentator at GBH Boston. I turn it over to Callie.
Good afternoon. I'm so delighted to engage in this conversation with my panelists. This is really quite striking in this way. I realized in preparation for this conversation how very little I knew about what African American folks were doing in Reconstruction with regard to health and well-being of others, and what happened during Reconstruction that allowed them to be able to take advantage of opportunities that were not at all possible before during enslavement. So I want to begin with a question that just can compare and contrast what was not available during enslavement and what significant thing, if you can pick one thing that immediately became available in Reconstruction and why it was significant in that moment to then lead us to where we are today. I'll start with you, Adam.
Thanks for that, Callie. I think one of the things we could probably point to as far as being a significant change in the Reconstruction period would have to do with, a sense of community. I want to say that, Black doctors really throughout the South and Black people who wanted to practice as medical practitioners would have had an opportunity to move and to relocate, and they would have had an opportunity to bond together. And what we see is, the beginning of sort of institutions that emerge with the intent to serve African American students, and schools like Howard University, which is one of the oldest Black medical schools that we have. Take on a great prominence, during that time period, and it gives people an opportunity to envision just the possibility of becoming educated. And we know education was such a fundamental thing that freedmen pursued in the period following the Civil War. Black communities knew that education was a critical step in securing their freedom and maintaining their freedom. And going on to become a practitioner was something that a medical practitioner, that is, was something that we see Black communities beginning to sort of to make an effort in much more sort of formal and kind of extensive ways. And we see some of the most noteworthy, I want to say, communities that happen in the DC area where Howard University is. And so I think in terms of how you kind of framed your question, I think that the possibility of becoming a practitioner and the investment in education are two things that would have been most notably sort of transformative at the end of the Civil War.
Okay. Vanessa, what exactly, there were no medical schools of the kind that Adam was talking about. That came later, but right coming out of enslavement into Reconstruction, there was openings all over the place, because for the first time, Black folks had some political power to make some things happen. So what significantly happened there so that we were able to be led then to the possibility of having training for Black professionals?
So, Callie, first of all, I think we need to talk about freed people and not just freed men. Because women were involved in these activities, and also with what happened at after the Civil War. And I think one of the things that happened after the Civil War that is critical to look at is that there was an acute need. So even before we talk about education, there was an acute need for practitioners. That because one of the main questions after the Civil War was who was going to care for the freed people? Who were so we don't go just into educational facilities. That we had other healers, and I think the other thing too, to get back to one of your comments, Callie, was that that there were Black doctors before the end of the Civil War. For example, James McCune Smith got his degree in Glasgow in 1837. David Peck, but he had David Peck, the first Black man to get his degree, got it from Rush in Chicago in 1847. And then Rebecca Crumpler, the first Black woman to get a medical degree, got her degree in 1864. And so that you have these practitioners before the end of the Civil War. But the other thing too is that the first Black institutions, the medical schools we're talking about, were started Howard in 1867 by the federal government, and Meharry by white brothers in 1876. So you see the growth of institutions and the need for practitioners, because the question was who was going to take care of the freed people. And so that there was an acute need, and you find people, not just in terms of Howard providing care, you found women in the Washington, D.C. area also providing care. They were not physicians, but they were caregivers.
Wangui, would you add to that?
Definitely. I think it's also important to remember that for this period that we're talking about, the kinds of procedures we associate with medicine, including delivering babies, nursing the sick, being those kinds of caregivers, all of that was taking place within the home, not the hospital. This was really domestic healing work that was undertaken and overseen primarily by women, including Black women. So our understanding of these histories and of these stories and figures really needs to include this broad sense of healers, of midwives, of nurses who were very much attending to and carrying out the large share of healing and care work in Black communities. So we really can't limit ourselves to those who were able to receive a medical degree or an advanced degree in the sciences, as important as that is, because that doesn't fully encompass who was providing the bulk of care in the late 19th century.
What about the names of some people? Vanessa gave us a few names of folks who were doing some of this work at that time. Who would you add, Wangui?
So, I mean, one person I do want to expand on, which Vanessa Gamble mentioned, was Rebecca Crumpler, because she's the first Black woman physician to earn a medical degree. And she really exemplifies the way in which this vanguard generation of Black physicians were politically engaged and committed to educating as well as treating those who didn't have access to other forms of healthcare. So she is traveling to the South, to Virginia, right in the aftermath of the Civil War, to provide medical aid to those who were formerly enslaved, to freed people. And she also uses her platform to really raise awareness about the health challenges facing poor and working class families, and goes on to publish a book where she's not only providing advice, but really emphasizing the importance of preventative measures, really calling out what we might later associate with the social determinants of health. Why can we, in the ways we can understand how things like infant death and sickness remain major concerns in Black communities. There are also figures like Sarah Mapps Douglas, who is attending medical courses also before Reconstruction, and using that training to educate and to provide lectures to Black women, to Black men across the North. And so she's also part of this work of really health education and public health information that you see happening in amongst these pioneer African Americans who are pursuing medical training in various capacities.
And can I add something to this, and to tell you a part of the problem that we face. For example, the museum had an exhibit, a digital exhibit on Black pioneers in medicine, and they had a picture of someone who they purported to be Rebecca Crumpler. It was not Rebecca Crumpler. It was Mary Eliza Mahoney, the first woman, a Black woman a trained nurse. So this shows the problem in terms of the lack of information out there. If the museum has it wrong, that they did take it down after some phone calls. But that shows, I think, the crux of the problem, where we really don't talk about these folks. And to follow up about Rebecca Crumpler, the second Black woman to get a physician was another Rebecca Cole, who got hers from Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, and she called out Du Bois on some of his work. And so you have this combination of care and political activism. But the other thing, even someone such as Elizabeth Keckley, who you might know as the person who created those magnificent gowns for Mary Todd Lincoln, she was head of something called the Colored Relief Society in Washington, and they provided care. So, so to look at this, we can't just look at the physicians, but I agree that we have to look at things in terms of caregiving.
Okay. Adam, are there names that you want to add to this?
Well, one of the things I would add to this is I think, I really appreciate that there's the bifurcation that we often have between folk medical practices and organized healing are really sort of broken down during this era, because a lot of Black practitioners start out as folk healers and then go on to get medical degrees. They get medical training in that way. One person that I would think of that kind of takes us maybe a little bit out of the period of Reconstruction, though, would be Daniel Hale Williams. He's born during the era of Reconstruction, and he goes on to become he's known for performing one of the first successful open heart surgeries, but he's also played a major role in building Providence Hospital in Chicago, which was an integrated hospital facility that was oriented toward cutting edge sort of surgical and medical practices in the 1890s. He goes on to become an influential reformer in medicine. He also works at Howard University and goes on to be one of the founders of the American College of Surgeons. But other Black practitioners who also sort of start in that same period, even like during Reconstruction and in the years following it, many of them start out as folk healers. Charles Roman, who was actually Canadian and comes to the United States and ultimately gets his degree from Meharry Medical College, he says that he started out as a folk healer. So in terms, I think Vanessa and one guy are both making points that are really critical here, which is to say that they recognize a need and they're working to serve it in meaningful kind of ways. And that breaking down this really dichotomy between sort of professional medicine and then folk healing, I think is also something that if we want to look at the history of Black medical healers during this time period, we really need to do.
But Anna, I'm not sure I totally agree with you.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why I don't totally. That is looking at it from the perspective of medicine. I think that when you look at it from the perspective of patients, they don't care as much as that it's a folk healer. Some of the women who, when Guy looks at, might be considered by the medical professional folk healers, but that that might be the perspective of the elite medical practitioner. But if somebody is there giving you care and nobody else is, you're not going to make the same dichotomy as medicine might.
And I would agree with that as well. And I think that's actually a really a powerful commentary, not so much even on, I think it's a commentary on how we think about history, right? So if we are thinking about medical healers and medical science, then that's very different than, and so we think about it in this kind of way that sort of suggests that, you know, we should start with the doctors. But if we're talking about health and healing and activism, then we should start, I mean, from a historical perspective, we should think about the lens that patients are sort of are utilizing here. And I mean, I think it's fair to say also, you know, trained physicians weren't always the favored medical providers of
Right.
Black communities, right? A lot of times, I mean, you know, Black physicians often talk about the process that they have to go through, and often it's an unsuccessful process of gaining the trust and respect of Black communities who are used to receiving care from people they know, people who are familiar to them. And so I think what you're saying is actually, I mean, I'm in complete agreement with it. It's our perspective. I think when we write about history and we talk about health and healing, we need to think about it in a much more kind of democratic way, which is what I think you're describing.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the questions that the museum is really interested in and having on the record is why do we just not know these names? I mean, the only name that I knew that you all mentioned was Daniel Dale Williams, and I think I must have learned that a long time ago in a Black history lesson. And Daniel Hale Williams, I think it's his name, and that's because of the open heart surgery. But that's not it for me. And I'm kind of well informed, so this is shameful, I will say.
Well, if I can start, if you don't mind, I think it also has to do with how we tell historical narratives, like the historical narratives that we like to tell. I mean, one of the things that we might be very uncomfortable with is that when we talk about Black physicians per se, like when we think about an individual like Ben Carson today, we might be more comfortable thinking of him as the exception when he's actually much closer to the mean than we might like to say, which is to say we may see a number of examples of Black physicians who make tremendous sort of contributions to the science part of of medicine in some ways, but then politically are very much aligned against the kind of civil rights activists and the progressive kind of narratives that we tend to think go with African American history. And I think, I mean, in many ways, we like to think of doctors as these heroic figures, right? And symbolically, they very much carry that image. But on the ground, practically, I mean, we see Black communities distrusting them, not comfortable with them. We see often Black doctors making a bigger effort to orient toward their professional aspirations rather than serving the broader needs of Black patients and communities. And so I think there's a very real reason why we don't see them as much. And part of that is because the history of Black doctors is a lot more contested. It's a lot less comfortable. It doesn't fit into the dominant narratives of African American history that we generally like to tell, that tend to go from slavery to freedom, so to speak.
Yeah,
I think there's another.
Yes,
yeah,
here, and I just want to be clear that my "we" actually didn't mean just African American folks. I meant why in history, why in general are these names not known. So yeah, I'm going.
Of course. So I think, 2 points. First, there's, I think, a tendency to think about Black engagement with the medical sciences really through the lens of exploitation and experimentation. And there's good reason for this. There are a number of well-documented examples of egregious harms to Black communities that have been justified in the name of advancing scientific knowledge. And at the same time, people of African descent have been instrumental to the rise of modern medicine, as we've been detailing here, through their skilled roles as practitioners and researchers, and also as critics. And in part, when we talk about major periods of US history, like the Reconstruction Era, we tend to focus on, I think, the important legal changes and the political transformations that occurred, but developments within medicine and science, they often get left out of these broad historical narratives, in part because we think of science as something that only takes place in the laboratory, or medicine and medical care is really confined to the hospital. But the way we understand the natural world around us, the way we understand what makes us sick, what makes us healthy, what can make us healthy, these are all major drivers of historical change. So I think part of it is about really reconciling and centering the ways in which medical ideas and scientific ideas have been so instrumental in reorganizing and transforming society in the same way that we think about things within the realm of the law and politics and education and so forth.
I'm going to take a little different approach here, and I think that's because my two younger colleagues here are living at a time or is more interest in looking at Black folks in medicine. You know, I have been doing this long enough where, you know, even within the history of medicine, people who were interested in this were discouraged or they're dissuaded or put down. And so I think that is a part of the problem. So I'm talking about this in terms of having practitioners who can do the work. That is slowly, but like I created the first course ever on the history of African Americans in the medical profession, and finding materials, you know, was really difficult. So I think that is part of the issue. The other thing too, even in the document that we were sent about Reconstruction, there wasn't anything really on health about it. And so that I think that a large part of this conversation has to do with how do we get health and issues around medicine and into broader narratives in American history, also in African American.
Something that you mentioned in passing, Vanessa, that I think needs to be raised up, and that is caregivers, practitioners, however you want to define them, from Reconstruction forward, never could just really focus on the work of healing, if you want to put it like that. They had a second job, which was really to deal with, if you describe it as the politics or the systemic racist structures, but either way, they had to sort of do both things in order to be able to make anything happen for folks that really needed their care. This just seems to be a part of the history of the advancements of folk in medicine. I'm going to start with you, Wangui. What do you say to that?
I think that it's, you know, that those issues really come to the fore, especially when we're looking at Black women who are entering into medicine and the sciences, because they had to contend with entrenched racism and sexism in these fields, and confronting skepticism that because they were women, they wouldn't be able to cope and handle the gory, the gruesomeness of medical practice. And because of their race, they were intellectually incapable of mastering the medical sciences and the arts around it. And so throughout their careers, you see in the kinds of firsthand accounts that we're able, you know, to the extent that we are able to have them and recuperate them from the archives, Black women describing the considerable slights that they faced from their training all the way through, of being told that they're stepping out of place in providing care and attending to the communities that they are, or in publishing when they dare to publish. And so these aren't challenges or obstacles that go away once they've earned that degree or once they're pedigreed in the way that we might recognize, but that they continue to face and encounter and navigate around as they remain committed to doing the work that they do.
Vanessa, how do you answer that question about the politics and the work, doing the work?
I mean, I think it's both. Because one of the things that we haven't really spent time talking about is disease, incidents of disease after the Civil War. There was a belief that tuberculosis did not exist before Black folks were freed. You know, white physicians in mainstream medical journals wrote about this. And so you have Black physicians not just providing care, but also trying to fight this politically. That, you know, this is, you know, that gets into some of the issues around genetic susceptibility. There is a belief by white physicians that Black people's bodies their bodies were incapable for freedom. And since Black bodies were incapable for freedom, then you have a higher incidences of diseases. So you found Black physicians not just providing care, but as you talked about, Callie, being also involved in the politics. Someone such as Rebecca Cole, the second Black woman to get a medical degree, talks about, color phobia, meaning racism. So they do double work. And I also want to point out that the belief that Black women are taking, Black women physicians are taking the place of white men has not ended. So I just want to put that out there, that is something that still continues. And I personal experience.
Since this is a discussion about historical insights looking at what's happening today to the present, we can look at COVID and what you said about diseases, and all of a sudden was only Black people had this, not everybody else. There's a certain kind of thing that was happening that made this disease more potent for certain folks in the mind of some. So this is a constant thread, it seems to me, that no matter where you are in the period of history, it comes back to Black bodies don't feel pain, whatever is out there now that's trending, it remains as part of the dialogue. Adam, how would you answer that about the juggling of both the political and the doing the work as caregiver?
Yeah, I think that a lot of physicians were very conscientious about seeing their jobs as having very real political sort of implications to it. I remember an article that was published, this is in the early 20th century, by a Black physician from South Carolina who said, we have a greater duty before us than the mere practice of medicine, right? That's how it started. And I think what Black practitioners often realize is that in order to address the health needs of African American communities, they have to challenge these notions of race. They have to challenge these notions of Black people being impervious to certain diseases, or being predestined to die out from certain, whether it's an infectious disease or from an evolutionary process, whatever it is. The idea that there's really no way, I think, for people to address matters of health substantively without sort of acknowledging the context in which their patients live, right? The context and the conditions that are producing the kind of health issues that they're confronted with. I'd leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think to show this, to illuminate this, and I thought it was wonderful that as people were waiting to get come into the session, that what was on the screen was a publication by Dr. W. Montague Cobb, medical care and the plight of the Negro. Yeah, that. And that, was originally published in The Crisis, which was the NAACP journal, and then it was released as a pamphlet to be handed out. And he basically talks about, racism in medicine, racism in medical education, and at a time where the NMA was starting to get the National Medical Association, which was the Black Medical Association, which was established in 1805 in Atlanta. That it was trying to push them to get more politically active around issues around desegregation. So it shows this connection between the practice of medicine, Black institutions, and also medical care.
So as we know, Reconstruction was a short period of time, and that was supposed to be the open, I'm using air quotes, time
right.
for folks of color to be able to have greater opportunities, and it was for a short period of time. But then the door closed, so to speak, and we're back to battling, maybe we never left, some of this systemic racist structures that made it even more problematic for folks to practice and to care for folks of color, and for folks of color to be practitioners. So I wonder if there's one significant movement out of Reconstruction that you can look at now that is still influencing us today, because this is to the present, that we need to look at, that started really after Reconstruction closed down, if you will? Or is that?
I would say establishment of Black medical institutions. That the NMA is still in existence. You also see that you have the establishment of the Black nurses, National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses. You see the establishment of Black hospitals, and so that the establishment of these institutions, but also to show that Black people were taking care of themselves. And one of the problems I have with African American medical history these days is this focus on just the oppression, the exploitation. Yes, that's important. I've written, but that Black people in this era, when they did not have anything, what they did and what they established, I think that is a critical part of the story. And so when I talk to students a lot, I talk about, look, here are these Black people, during the Civil War, right after the Civil War, who are becoming physicians, who were caring for our neighborhoods, who were establishing institutions so that they could see that we did not take this sitting down.
And they still exist, these institutions created.
Right.
Yes. Wangui, what would you say?
I completely agree. I also was thinking about the community institution building that's happening, and really recognizing that this was a movement. This is something that was not just limited to even healers or practitioners, but you see laundry women, you see cooks, you see drivers contributing small amounts, what they can, in money or in goods, to help build these small hospitals, to help provide childcare and kindergartens within their communities, to establish and maintain these professional societies and these maternity wards. And that is a very broad movement that's happening across the country and is really buttressed, on a local level, but is something that is definitely deserves more attention and more study in that sense.
And Adam?
Yeah, and I think, I don't think we can underestimate the significance of the Flexner era reforms. And Abraham Flexner was a educational reformer in the early 20th century, and with the support of the AMA and the Carnegie Foundation, he issued a major report that led to really a transformative, I want to say, moment in organized medicine, and which is to say that in an effort, an effort that was motivated largely by physicians' desires to sort of eliminate competition, right? And to make medicine more exclusive and to make their practices more lucrative, right? And a lot of what we see sort of happening during this era of the Flexner reforms is we see more stringent requirements for undergraduate and medical training, an extension of the amount of time that it takes to actually achieve these degrees, and a notable increase in the expense involved with obtaining a medical degree. And what we actually kind of see happening is a lot of times people sort of think of this as the era where medicine becomes modern, right? And that's such a loaded kind of term, because what we actually see is that, these transformations don't actually lead to therapeutic revolution, right? They're not making these sort of changes with the idea that this is going to produce more therapeutically efficacious medicine. The most immediate impact and really long-term impact of these innovations, of these reforms, is that it leads to the closing of over half the medical schools in the United States and in Canada. And it leads to the closing of 5 of the 7 Black medical schools that exist already in the U.S., right? So now we have Howard and Meharry. We got Morehouse as well. But at the time, yes, thank you. But at the time, it sort of limited, it reduced it down to just Howard and Meharry. And what we see really emerging in medicine is what we might call sort of like a prestige and exclusion kind of economy, where there is a premium that's placed on how exclusive these institutions are and how prestigious they are. And what the requirements do is they essentially make getting a medical degree too expensive for people of color, for women, for new immigrant communities, and they make the actual practitioners who can participate and become doctors, it makes them more exclusively white, more from middle class, upper middle class, and elite sort of class society. And these are changes that continue to shape the medical field today, right? That we continue to see an impact from, right? So when we talk about the percentage of Black physicians who were practicing in like in 1920, that number was about 2%. I think when we get to 1998, that number is still 2%, right? Even though we see an era in the 1960s where we say we have integrated. What we actually see happening is that segregation is sort of baked into the pipeline here, the educational pipeline. And that's an impact. I mean, these are kind of like the structural forms of inequity that continue to shape the medical field and medical education.
Okay, then how do we ensure that these stories, these names, these contributions of both caregivers and practitioners, or the whole umbrella of African-American caregivers, get into all the places they should be, and to be taught in public school, and to be taught, for that matter, in medical school? Vanessa, you were talking about having to create the first course about some of this history. So what needs to happen to ensure that these stories finally get where they need to be?
I mean, I think this is a place, I'm glad to see that the museum is working with NHGRI with these conversations. But I think that it would be useful if the museum worked with, some medical historian who are involved in a history of African Americans and medicine, to try to come up with some type of action plan where, when you come to the museum, you see, particular exhibits, but then things such as working with school kids and having different materials. I think, that is one way. I mean, I think one way that's also starting to happen in medical schools, with talking about racism in medical schools, that one of the things I always push is that this whole conversation is about anti-racism in medicine is not new. And one of the things that has delighted me is the opening of so many different archives where you find new materials. And those of us who do this work, we share things because that we feel so that this work is so important. And also portraiture is important. Medical schools now are trying to, change whose pictures are on the wall, to remind people that, that it was only white men are not the only people who graduated from, medical and also from nursing school.
Wangui?
Yeah, I really appreciate those practical ways to think about how to implement it. I also think it requires a real revising and reassessing of the kinds of broad historical narratives that are included in curricula, but also included in things like museum exhibits, and really centering the fact that the fight for medical care and for medical training have been central to struggles for Black freedom, for civil rights and racial justice. And those are often, if they appear at all, very much marginalized or on the periphery, but are, as we've been discussing in this panel and in many other spaces, so critical to the broader demand for full and equal rights that I think would change the picture in terms of how we understand not only African American history, but what US history looks like across centuries.
Adam?
Yeah, and I want to amplify what Wangui and Vanessa just said here. And Vanessa, first, I mean, I can't agree with you more about, your critique of anti-racism. I think in an unfortunate way, anti-racism, or at least conversations, anti-racism has almost kind of become the new "I have Black friends," right?
Right.
It's the way you kind of signal that you're on board without actually having to do any of the difficult work that's sort of involved there. But I also, I mean, I
Let me interrupt
want
you and
to.
say, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, who is Mr. Anti-Racism, would tell you anti-racism is action. Now, continue.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And I'm not saying that, his intent is off, but I think the way it gets used now, it's more like a form of signaling rather than it is an act. Like if you say it, then it's a way of saying, yeah, you're on people's side. But one of the things that Wangoy sort of brought up that I think I like is I think we need to think about how we teach history very differently, right? And I also think when we talk about health and healing in history, I think it's an important motivating factor for civil rights activism, but it's also important for us to talk about it from the bottom up, right? From the experience of the people who are suffering, right? From the experience of Black communities, patients, and their encounters with issues that concern health, the impact it has on them, and giving students ways to sort of connect in that regard. I think the narratives of hero worship that too often sort of shape how we understand the past don't do us service for the long term. It can often be very discouraging. It can often be something that that I think puts students off in many regards. And the more we can sort of tell histories from the bottom up that focus on the larger kind of social experiences that people have, and I think the better off we are in terms of transforming how we think about the past and making the past something that becomes much more meaningful and significant for people in the present.
Okay. We are now at the time where we can hear from the audience, and they have many questions for all of you. Let me begin with one. What medical innovations did Black people come up with that are not in the history books? And any one of you can take it.
I will take one that some historians of medicine know about, and if you were at Hopkins, you know about, and that is the story around Vivian Thomas, who was a man who did work with Alfred Blaylock on open heart surgeries. And that worked with Blaylock in terms of some of the techniques, and the other thing about that story is that I've talked with white surgeons who said everything they learned about surgery and how to do surgery, they learned about from actually some of you might know about this from Members of the Heart, but also the fictionalized version of Vivian Thomas's life called Something the Lord Made, with Mos Def playing Vivian Thomas. Yeah.
Okay. Any other names, Adam or Wangui? Or not names, innovations, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, if I can add to what Vanessa is saying, though, I actually think Vivian Thomas is really the tip of the iceberg, which is to say, he's known for being this sort of amateur expert who is really one of the leading surgeon in the field. But I actually think that when we look at medicine and medical progress, and this is something that I think I'm hoping we will learn more about. I think there are a lot of amateur experts, that is, say, Black practitioners who sort of occupy a place on the margin, who don't get credit, but have a very significant and noteworthy influence on the development of medicine over time. So I think there are certainly
I'm gonna stop you right there. That's good. Okay. Just because I want to get more questions in. Wangui, if you don't have anything to add, I'm gonna jump to some other questions. You let me know.
It's just I think if we were just to look at birth cultures and the way in which women, their experiences giving birth have changed so dramatically over the past 2 centuries, Black midwives and Black midwifery now has a a resurgence. It has a certain kind of cachet. It is something that people, with certain kinds of resources might opt into or turn to. But to really kind of look at the historical origins of that and the kinds of traditions that Black women and Black midwives and healers were drawing on, were passing on, were really perfecting and bringing in generations of their communities into life, into health, that isn't something that gets patented, but is something that has such a huge imprint in terms of speaking to women's concerns, in terms of how they feel safe, how they feel comfortable, what they desire and choose for their birthing experiences, for their journey into motherhood. It's those kinds of examples, that kind of labor and those kinds of contributions that I think are important to highlight as well.
All right, that leads me into a question from the audience for you, Ngui, which is modern gynecology and how contributions of Black midwives have been ignored. Now, I think you just touched on it. Is there, if you want to add something to that, that's what the questioner wants to know.
Sure. I think, to expand on that a bit and to think about the ways in which, particularly with modern obstetrical and gynecological practices and really modern medicine is so focused on a risk calculus and any attempts to prevent or to reduce and minimize any kind of risks, and seeing the birthing person and the newborn as almost competing, or two different kinds of individuals to attend to. Midwifery, the work that Black midwives have done in terms of thinking about birth as not just an event, something that you arrive at and then leave within a matter of moments or hours, but something that you are attending to in the weeks and months leading up to it and in the weeks afterwards. That it's such a fundamentally different approach, something that you see in modern medicine in terms of thinking about prenatal care and postpartum care, but midwifery, has that much more holistic sense of what is involved and what is entailed. And I think that it's that kind of perspective of the investment that the practitioners and the healers bring into the work, where it's not just, something that you are focusing on simply catching the baby as it comes out, but attending to the entire circumstance and condition in which this birth is taking place is really important as well.
And you see that now with the growth in Black doulas, the number of people having their births at home with Black doulas.
For you, Vanessa, the question is, could you talk a little bit about the Tuskegee syphilis study, your work with it, and what other experiments were done to Black bodies during slavery and after? Now, we have
first of all, I will make this very brief because, and I will say, I do not call it the Tuskegee syphilis study. I call it the United States Public Health Syphilis Study at Tuskegee. And I was involved in helping President Clinton apologize for it. And we made sure that it's about the United States Public Health Syphilis Study at Tuskegee. In large part because to make people understand that the Public Health Service was the major agency underscoring it. I mean, I think a lot has been written about that and about, the experimentations. And that one of the things I just want to say is that in my work, I do not use the word distrust, and it has come up a lot lately with vaccines, that I think is incorrect to say that the syphilis study has led to distrust of African Americans. I've done research that shows that the attitudes of African Americans predated the syphilis study, and it's not just about experimentation. It might be because of what's happening today in terms of everyday racism. And that what I think we need to talk about is trustworthiness. What have we done to create trustworthy medical institutions? So I'll just leave it there.
All right.
And if I can add a little bit of something onto that, I think it's really pertinent to recognize that Tuskegee isn't the exceptional kind of event that we tend to sometimes think of it as, right? Lewis Wright, who was a Black physician and one of the earliest Black graduates of the Harvard Medical School, he said on the first anatomy class that he went to, in the front of the amphitheater, there was a Black cadaver hanging from its ears and being held up by ice tongs, right? And that this was part of a tradition that went on at Harvard. He said a couple of years.
Right. One thing I just want to call you out on, Adam. I think that historians who do work in African American history, we have to be very careful about using the term Tuskegee, because that means that that's the only thing that happened at Tuskegee Institute. There are very good things that happened at Tuskegee Institute to make sure that Black people were taken care of. And I think that that is part of the problem, where we are focusing on some of the gory things and not just about what we have done to take care of ourselves and still do to take care of ourselves.
And I'm not disagreeing with you, and I apologize for using that term, though. But I think we're on the same page with this. I think.
Adam, the questioner wants you to further explain folk healing and what knowledge did enslaved persons have, and what methods did they use?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm like the best person to respond to that question, but I think one of the things that we kind of see is like there's a lot more fluidity in Black communities when we talk about like whether there's a religious healing practices, whether there are domestic healing practices. And I think one of the things that we kind of sort of see taking place with that is, it takes a very long time, and it's still something that probably I would say shapes Black communities as well. That we, there are alternatives to organized medicine that Black communities rely on, right? And I think one of the things that maybe does sort of speak even to the, I want to say the current historical moment is the mistrust that we see happening in medicine has been earned, right? And there are reasons why Black communities and people who are disenfranchised, so to speak, why they go places outside of organized medicine. And that is often because of concerns about medicine being more of a tool of extraction, right? More of a tool of exploitation than one where it's inclined to make people whole again.
All right.
So I'll say briefly, I have a friend who was asked to be on President Clinton's commission on complementary and alternative medicine. And someone at the meeting said to her, I did not know that Black people were interested in alternative and complementary medicine. And I told her what she should have said is that, yes, when we are involved with it, they want to say it's folk medicine. So I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, interesting. Last question. What medical training did African Americans have before emancipation? You all referenced some of the people that had it. And was this training challenged when they gained greater access during Reconstruction?
I mean, there was not, there were Black people who went to medical schools before the Civil War. As I said, the first Black person to get a degree in the United States was in 1847. But one of the things, too, we have to think about where the practices of African Americans were, that mostly African Americans took care of Black patients. And so there was not a lot of competition for, white people in terms of taking care of Black people, except maybe for some Black people who had means. So that there was not a lot of blowback because it was expected. This was the time of Jim Crow. And when we talk about Reconstruction and then redemption, we also have to talk about Jim Crow. And so it was the expectation that Black physicians would practice in the Black medical world only.
Mm. And so when you start thinking about something else, then it became problematic.
Right.
Adam, you were trying to.
Yeah. I don't think there's ever been a time when Black doctors have not been questioned in their practices, whether that was, from at the period of emancipation or since then. I think what we actually see is that in a lot of cases, Black physicians become very skilled at learning how to build trust and learning how to navigate the mistrust and distrust of them that they encounter with Black communities. And yeah,
well, this sounds like disrespect too. So you're saying distrust, but it also sounds like disrespect in terms of your qualifications, quote unquote.
I think absolutely. And I mean, there are Black patients who will, in an emergency room, getting attended to a Black doctor who will say, I want a white doctor. I would rather have a white doctor, right? And I think what Black doctors do is that's an experience that they kind of have all through their educational lives and all through their careers. And I think what we find, I mean, there's been some fairly recent studies that show that Black patients have better outcomes when they're attended to by Black physicians. And these are fairly preliminary, so I'm not trying to make any grandiose statement here. But I think when we look into this further, what we'll find is that many patients have better outcomes when they're attended to by Black practitioners, because I think Black practitioners are in a position where they have to cultivate a set of skills where they can build trust and they can build, they can garner confidence that other practitioners aren't always required to develop. And so when they are confronted with skeptical patients or skeptical communities, they have a layer, and really, I mean, you might very well say a lifetime of experience building that kind of confidence. So, yeah.
Yes, I see. Wangu, you want to have the last word?
I mean, just to return to your initial question on this, and to think about, you know, what are those major transformations that come with Reconstruction and after Emancipation. And, you know, not only for the majority of African Americans who are enslaved, not only is the education of enslaved people illegal in most Southern states, but also in states like South Carolina, by the end of the 18th century, you have laws on the books that make it illegal for slaves to work with doctors, to work with apothecaries, to administer medicine to slaves unless they're under the supervision of a white person. There are these fears of poisoning, of inciting rebellion. So there's so many layers of these issues of trust, of policing the boundaries of what Black healers and practitioners can and can't do. That's important to keep into this context as we're thinking about what is so pivotal in these early periods when we're moving into Reconstruction and the post-Reconstruction era of Jim Crow.
I thought that was my last question, but I think I might have a teeny time for this one. I'm just going to pick one from the audience. Is there anything being done to allow for policies to be passed geared towards diversity, equality, equity, and inclusion in medical admission and education?
There are, since, you know, I used to work at the Association of American Medical Colleges, and as a, you know, as a medical educator, I can say that there are. And the thing is, it's not just at the admissions level, but also trying to get people to be leaders in medical education, because that's where a lot of the changes are, you know, the change needs to happen in terms of top down. But the other thing too is that right now, the question is to make sure that these programs are sustained.
Right. Any other additions? Okay. I want to thank you all for joining me for this great conversation, which is a wonderful complement to the current exhibit that's going on at the museum. And everybody should pay attention to that. And I think we've all learned that we don't know a lot about this particular area, your area of expertise. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm now going to turn the program over to Leslie Walker.
Thank you, Callie, and our wonderful panelists for such a rich conversation. This afternoon drew over 170 viewers. The conversation in the chat also appeared to be very lively. Thank you so much for viewing, and we hope that you join us for the rest of this programmatic series. Have a wonderful afternoon, and goodbye.